Good. Hi, Matthias. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Martin. What have we got? We've got Matthias up first, then Lisa, and then Dr. Colt Anderson. Colt Anderson. Oh, that's you, yes. Oh, great. Brilliant. Well, we just got a couple of minutes to go, but I really wanted to thank you actually for offering a paper on this subject matter. It's not a doesn't always bring in a deluge of papers. It's a difficult subject matter, and in some senses, reflecting back on Claire Watkins' paper, it offers a sort of a limit experience in terms of how churches hold the tensions between survivors and the institution together, etc., and the discernment of spirit within that. So it's just a personal thanks for me for offering these papers. Good. Teresa, were you just ringing to remind me to join the panelists, were you?
Yeah, because you were in as an attendee, so I've just swapped you over.
So when I join these, generally join from that initial link then.
Right. Yeah, that's fine.
Good. Right. Well, I'm waiting for 15. Stickler for time like that. But everything going well so far? Enjoying the conference? Good. So just so you know, I'm Marcus Pound, Dr. Pound. I'm at Durham University, and I've been running a project for the last few years, Boundary Breaking, which is exploring the sort of cultural implications of sexual abuse within the Catholic context in England and Wales. And that's led us into various territories. Over the last year, we've been engaging the number of different groups and individuals, survivors, priests, lay people, etc. So I'm very excited about hearing these different sort of global contributions. And I think that one of the things I've learned is that, there is a sort of, there's a sort of global dimension to this, as we see in the reports generally, but there's also very specific aspects. Ireland is not England, church-state relations are different. And so bringing out those specificities, I think, is quite important. Anyway, it is now 1:15, so we're going to run 3 papers, and we're going to run them back to back, 15 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up for general discussion. Next up is it you, Lisa?
Yes.
Yes, do say a few words about yourself.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Pound. I just want to thank everybody for being here today, and I'm very grateful that my paper was received. Although I'm well into my middle age, I'm actually, I think, what they would term an emerging scholar. I did my theology studies some years ago, did some professional work, and then took a very long break to be at home with my family and run a farm. And I have only recently returned to academic theology, but I'm very grateful for this conference because my own life has reflected the fact that experience is the source for theology, or one of our sources, perhaps the most important one. So I'm very grateful for this. This is a kind of a short version of a paper that I gave last year. I was asked to give a paper as part of a symposium on clerical sexual abuse of women. And so that's where this comes from. Noli me tenere, do not hold on to me. These are the words with which Christ addresses Mary Magdalene at his resurrection appearance in the 20th chapter of John. Mary, as you may recall, had gone to the Garden of Gethsemane to anoint the body of Jesus. Faced with an apparently violated tomb, she gathers Peter and John, who return with her, see the empty tomb with the burial cloth set aside and leave at once. Mary, however, remains. And as she is standing there crying, Jesus appears to her. Woman, why do you weep? Whom do you seek? At first, Mary thinks he is the gardener, but then he calls her by name and she moves at once to embrace him. Do not hold on to me, he tells her, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. This scene has spawned a vast literature and iconography. In the scriptures, of course, Mary Magdalene is the woman out of whom 7 demons have been cast. But the tradition, at least as early as Gregory the Great, also associated her with the unnamed woman of Luke, a sinner who washed Jesus' feet with her tears, dried them with her hair, and anointed them with costly perfume. Thus, in the church's art, Mary sometimes appears in this scene in the pleading, almost seductive pose of a former prostitute. The Lord, for his part, seems poised to fend her off as though protecting his own virginal status. In this context, Jesus' words, "Do not hold on to me," seem to be addressed to Mary, the former violated woman, as though she is someone to be held at bay. Someone who, because of her continual demand to be seen, heard, and touched, needs to be restrained, put off, or put in her place. This version of Mary in the garden, it seems to me, is an image of the difficult position of women who have suffered abuse in the church at the hands of their ministers. A lot of my pain, says abuse survivor Carrie Bucalo, comes from the fact that no one really knows it's there. No one can see it. I have this strange feeling that if people could see my spiritual wounds, maybe things would be different. Maybe my journey could change for the better. Victims of abuse who are baptized members of the Catholic Church have been left in silence. Perhaps the silence from church leadership has been out of respect for what we've suffered, but this silence has left us with a double wound. First, we were harmed by those who represented Christ in the church. Secondly, we feel abandoned and are left with a sense of ambiguity regarding how we are to draw close to God after what happened to us. What are we to do? What if practicing our Catholic faith puts us into direct contact with our deepest traumatic memories? What if we are not strong enough to face the trauma, or what if we need help? Carrie was abused throughout her childhood by her father, who was an active lay minister in the church, an usher, scripture study leader, marriage enrichment leader, and Eucharistic minister. He even played the part of Jesus in the parish Passion play. To this day, she says, I can still remember how many people in the parish considered my dad to be a real saint. Throughout her childhood, Carrie's father framed his sexual abuse in the context of Catholic images and rituals. Not surprisingly, Carrie experiences PTSD in relation to the Mass, the Rosary, and Catholic devotions. And of course, she's had to spend many years in psychotherapy to deal with this. Carrie's experience highlights a common suffering of women who have been abused within the church by the church's own ministers. Even as they deeply desire to belong in the church, to be seen and known, they are alienated by the precise helps that are offered, the Mass, the confessional, and the ministry of the priest, who now is the face of the abuser. And it seems to me it is into this troubling situation that Christ himself steps when he chooses to spend his time with the tax collectors and prostitutes. Christ shows a preference for those who are on the margins, who experience belonging as almost impossible, whose wounds make them unable to live in community with others. How, we must ask, does Jesus draw them in? What in his way of dealing with people makes them able to respond and feel loved? And how, in the end, can the Magdalene, a woman who has suffered the depersonalization of demonic possession and the social stigma attached to it, be so transformed by Christ that she can become a veritable beacon of human liberation, the apostle to the apostles, as she is called in the East, the first proclaimer of the resurrection? My proposal here is that only such a love, the love of Christ himself, lived and extended through our eyes, hearts, and hands, is an adequate answer to the suffering of abused women. And I would like to unfold an understanding of such love as it appears in the works of Monsignor Luigi Giussani, who is perhaps best known as the founder of the ecclesial movement, Communion and Liberation. Giussani names this sort of extraordinary love, Christ's love, virginity. And for the few minutes that I have left, I hope to explain 3 dimensions of virginity or virginal love in Giussani and highlight why I believe his approach offers some hope for a way of seeing and embracing victims. Now, we must admit in our world today, virginity evokes frigidity, an almost timorous relationship to the world. The virgin is the one who renounces sex, who distances himself or herself physically from other people, precisely for the sake of protecting this virginal purity, safeguarding it. In the church, such distancing has its own architecture. In the convent cloister, it has its own uniform and the veils and habits of women religious. In fact, such distance is indeed at the heart of the church's understanding of the value of virginity, an eternal dimension that is communicated through a fragile physical reality. The virgin or celibate is the one who renounces sex, marriage, childbearing, and rearing for the sake of a greater good, the kingdom of God. In refusing to engage in sexual union with another human being, the virgin, through his or her body, represents and makes present this commitment to God alone. It is marriage itself that gives to this deeper commitment a symbolic significance. In the mystical allegorical interpretation of the Song of Songs, the erotic relation of the bridegroom and bride is understood as a sign of Christ's union with the church, as well as the union of God with the individual soul. In the light of this tradition, the virgin can be said to be married to God in a supernatural fashion. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine, proclaims the bride of the Song of Songs. The virgin seeks to possess and to be possessed by the beloved, who is Christ. Yet, who is Christ? Is he not, and here I'm following kind of a trajectory of Gaudium et Spes 22, in Christianity, the fullness of meaning for all persons, the destiny of our humanity. Thus, in his or her commitment to Christ, the virgin seeks to serve and love all others, which is to say, to affirm their destiny in Christ. And this is Giussani's frequent phrase, our destiny in Christ. For Giussani, the detachment that is characteristic of the virgin, the renunciation, functions within this larger whole of love. Giussani says that virginal love is a possession with a detachment within. This is the first definition of virginity I would like to offer today: possession with a detachment within. The distance that the virgin takes on the world is not primarily for the sake of protecting or preserving the chastity of the virgin, but more deeply to permit the virgin to love the world in a truly disinterested way, to let the things of the world be, and indeed to let them be in all their distinctiveness and value. Thus, the second definition of virginity in Giussani is a quote, relating to things according to their truth, unquote. And scholar Paolo Prosperi comments on this. How can one make sense of such a claim? It is important to see, first of all, that the noblest form of possession, at least in the case of human beings, is knowing the truth of something. I can passionately kiss and embrace a glass, but if I do not know it is a glass, I cannot possess it with the same fullness as someone who instead quietly pours some good Brunello and drinks from it. To possess something in a human way means, first of all, to understand what that thing is, and then relate to it in the full respect of that truth. To truly know something as it is, which is a form of union, one needs to retain a sort of contemplative space, a reverent distance. This is the space of detachment. The sort of detachment is not primarily negative, but positive, a space of wonder, the drawing back that we do before that which we reverence. You cannot love a painting, Giussani often said, with your nose up against it. In the same way, and this is a point he often made with vehemence, a man cannot love a woman, his own wife even, if his whole desire is to have her for himself. This sort of possessiveness crushes the other, making them an instrument for my own needs. In this way, it becomes clear that for Giussani, virginal love is the inner form of marriage itself. This fact becomes apparent in marriages in which love perdures, even as one spouse can no longer offer anything to the other. When a husband cares for a wife who can no longer recognize him, is the case with one couple I know. Giussani suggests that precisely at the heart of the mutual possession that married persons experience through an exclusive sexual relationship, there is a fundamental awe before the being of the other that can sustain this love in all circumstances, including when that sexual relationship dissolves. This virginal core of Christian marriage is expressed in its indissolubility. Finally, it is in marriage and family life that a third dimension or definition of virginity becomes clear, a belonging that grants a greater freedom. And this can be seen, I believe, in the healthiest families, in which the parents' desire to care for and guide their children, the parents' desire to care for and guide their children contains within it a profound respect for the child's freedom, a wonder before the unique path that the child must take, and a willingness to help that child walk that path, whatever it is. Virginity is the love that seeks intimacy without absorption, that endures and even celebrates distance without abandonment. It is a love that is infinitely vulnerable because it wants nothing other than to let the other be, to serve the other precisely as other. Such a love, one that acknowledges the intrinsic value of distance, freedom, space, is deeply desired by those who have suffered sexual abuse. On her website, which is healedbytruth.com, Carrie tells of how during the pandemic, she was so deeply relieved that she did not have to go to Mass. This causes her to wonder, could the church extend to abuse survivors who suffer from PTSD a dispensation from weekly attendance to Mass to enable them to make a step toward greater healing? I think this is the sort of gesture that the church could offer victims. I think this would be the simplest, smallest first step. What is required is that we begin to see these people for the precise suffering that they have. It is a matter of looking at their real wounds to enter into the actual circumstances of these victims. What other steps could the church take to make the very difficult path of healing possible for them? In what ways can we accompany them on their very human but necessary journey? It seems to me that the only way to begin this journey is to love them and wonder at their wounds. I hope you will indulge me with a final mystical allegorical moment as we return to Mary in the garden. When Jesus tells Mary Magdalene to not hold on to him, to stop holding on to him, the meaning, it is often said, is liturgical sacramental. Only after he has ascended to the Father will Mary be able to hold him, to truly possess him, now as her Eucharistic Lord. Yet another strand of the tradition in the church reads Mary as the bride of the Song of Songs, the woman seeking her bridegroom. She is wayward humanity that has stumbled again into the Garden of Eden. Only when she is called by name by him who is both husband and Lord, both the new Adam and the one in whom the world was created, does she discover herself anew. In his gaze, she sees the truth of her creation. Behold, all is good. Yet could we not also say that in his do not hold on to me, Jesus is granting a space that he too might enjoy. This space, this distance between Jesus and Mary also means that Jesus can see Mary as she is. She is the one whose humanity he shares, bride, but also sister, the Song of Songs reminds us. Woman, why do you weep? He asks her. Does he not feel for her in this moment? Is he not moved by her even now? I would suggest that it is with such a gaze that we must look at our wounded sisters in this moment we are living. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for a beautiful paper and a highly unusual paper as well. I don't mean that in the context of the conference, but I mean in the sensitivities and perspective, particularly from the family into that complex dynamics. So and peppered with lots of sort of insightful, some practical suggestions too. So that was really beautiful. Thank you very much. And we'll have time to reflect on that a little later after Colt's presentation.
Okay.
So I have the video for you, Colt. Would you like me to play the video in, or do you want to prefer to do it live?
You know, actually, if you could plug the video in, that would be good.
No problem. I'll do that for you right away.
You know, while you're doing that, I'll say a little bit about myself. Well, never mind.
Yes, do.
Well, I was going to say briefly, I'm a church historian, and I've been working on the sexual abuse crisis for about 20 years. And most of my work has been from the standpoint of what I call pastoral care reform, which I think is how the church is responding to things. And since that time, I've moved to think that we need to move beyond simply pastoral care reform language to something a bit more administrative. So that's all I wanted to say.
I'll press ahead and play. Let me know if you can't hear the sound, but you should hear the sound start up in a few seconds.
I begin today with a question. Why is it that the Catholic Church seems unable to respond effectively to the sexual abuse crisis? When I say that the Church has been unable to respond effectively, I do not mean to deny progress. There are dioceses, orders, and organizations that have improved their policies and procedures. The progress, however, depends on the commitment, knowledge, and character of a local ordinary or superior, and it can change with a change in leadership. Progress has not been consistent or uniform. For example, the Charter for Protection of Children and Young People created a yearly audit for dioceses and eparchies in the United States. The audit's publicly released, which looks like a big step forward. Dioceses, however, are not required to participate. And from 2010 to 2019, there was not full participation in the audit. The audit released in 2020 found that 25 to 30% of the dioceses have dysfunctional review boards. It cited an AP News report that found that mandatory review boards are not working because bishops were appointing church defense attorneys and top aides to the boards. Bishops also controlled whether issues went to the board, what evidence the boards could see, and what criteria they must use in making decisions. Moreover, all of the work of these boards is confidential. Half of the dioceses do not even reveal the names of the members. And while these audits typically reveal what's going on in schools and parishes, they do not have access to clergy files or seminaries. In effect, the system is a form of isomorphic mimicry. When an organization appears to create something like a police force in a corrupt state, it does not actually function. This practice of projecting an image of competence without its substance is an indication that an organization is caught in a capability trap where it's unable to implement effective reforms. Part of the problem with implementing reform lies with our starting point. How we think about the church has an impact on how we understand the problem and the types of solutions we can envision. The three models of the church in Lumen Gentium, namely church as mystery, people of God, and hierarchy, are not useful for understanding systemic and ultimately institutional problems. The council framed these models in terms of pastoral care, with a focus on ministry, sin, and reconciliation. If we use just these categories, every problem looks like a pastoral problem. When you look at how the magisterium speaks about and responds to clericalism and sexual abuse, they frame the matter in terms of personal sins and the solution in terms of penance and renewal. Vos Estis Lux Mundi, for example, calls for the conversion of the bishops. And on November 4th of this year, Pope Francis urged the people of God to continue the journey of personal and community conversion, which requires a renewed formation. If the abuse crisis is the result of personal or communal sins, then the proper response is to aim at conversion and reconciliation. Reconciliation, however, does not imply punishment. Pastoral care prioritizes the need of the sinner, in this case the perpetrator, and employs categories like discretion and fraternal charity. While conversion and reconciliation are important, it is equally important to remember Pope Gregory the Great's dictum that a man can be forgiven and remain unfit for office in the church. Certainly, sin is an aspect of the crisis, but it doesn't explain why the problem of sexual abuse is so pervasive and persistent, or the failures to report abusive behavior, or the lack of punishment, except insofar as sin can be invoked to explain all the evils of the world. Starting from sin obscures the institutions, structures, and systems contributing to the crisis. To assess the problem effectively, we need to return to an older model of the church as institution. The institutional model of the church has fallen into disfavor and disuse among theologians. Cardinal Avery Dulles' critique of institutionalism, which he defined as treating the institutional element of the church as primary, has contributed to the reluctance to consider the sexual abuse crisis in light of this model. Dulles was also leery of this model because of its association with the perfect society theology. He felt that the stress it placed on the visible aspects of the church tended to lower the church to the same place as other human communities. Nonetheless, Dulles admitted that the Church of Christ does exist in this world, and it has an organization and structure that resembles the organizations and structures of other human societies. I see this model as valuable in its capacity to examine and evaluate the visible and human dimensions of the church, like those in other organizations. It can help us consider what we can learn from organizations that have struggled to implement lasting and effective reforms. If we consider the sexual abuse crisis using the institutional model, the church looks more like a fragile state than a perfect society. Using the method of institutional analysis developed by Douglas North, who won a Nobel Prize, I want to focus on what we can learn from economics. North distinguished institutions from organizations, offices, and structures, writing, "Institutions are the rules of the game in society, or more formally, are the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction." This distinction between institutions as humanly devised rules from organizations is important for analyzing problems. So too, it is important to distinguish organizations from their offices and from their structures. These rules, institutions, provide incentives and disincentives that influence decisions on the part of those who exercise oversight, as well as on the part of victims or survivors. Institutions are difficult to reform because they emerge from routine behavior, change incrementally, and are often internalized and unconscious. They play a heuristic role in decision-making. North distinguished between formal and informal institutions. So formal institutions are written, and they're found in things like policies, charters, and laws. However, laws are not necessarily institutions. Changing a law does not indicate institutional reform, because not all laws are rules. As Jeffrey Hodson aptly phrased it, ignored laws are not rules. A law is only a rule or an institution when it becomes internalized, customary, and normative. Informal institutions are unwritten and are found in customs, undocumented norms, rules governing client-patron chains. Economists have found that organizations that have many informal institutions are particularly well adapted to impede the implementation of changes to laws. And of course, the church has many undocumented norms, unwritten traditions, and patrimonial political relationships. The gift-giving culture among bishops, for example, is mostly unexamined, even though it creates conflicts of interest in the hierarchy, as was revealed in the notorious case of Bishop Bransfield. The complaints about Bransfield were ignored by men like the Apostolic Nuncio, who had received significant gifts. Because institutions are internalized, customary, and normative, reforming them requires third-party enforcement until the changes become truly normative. Unproductive paths, persistent problems, result from institutions or rules that initially provide a benefit, but impede future progress by creating incentives to maintain them. I believe the Catholic Church set out on an unproductive path with the efforts of the Gregorian reformers in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, when they argued for ecclesial liberty from lay oversight because of the superior holiness of the clergy. The Australian Royal Commission and institutional responses to child sexual abuse identified clericalism, defined as the idealization of the clergy, as a significant factor that creates the conditions for abuse and its concealment. I think it's important to recognize that the idealization of the clergy is not a matter of sin. It's an ideology promoted by the Catholic Church. Clericalism understood in this way does not call for a pastoral response. This idealization led to the creation of rules that would protect the image of the clergy by hiding their failures and crimes. North explained that organizations need to distinguish the motives and goals of employees or members from those of the organization in order to understand institutional and organizational failures. Clericalism, understood as the idealization of the clergy, blurs the distinction between offices and office holders. In the early Middle Ages, a bishop's office was seen as something that set limits to how the office holder behaved and what he could say. But the Catechism of the Catholic Church defines ecclesial ministry as personal Quote, finally, it belongs to the sacramental nature of ecclesial ministry that it have a personal character. If ministry is personal rather than functional, then there can be no clear metrics for evaluation for ministerial performance. The Catechism of the Catholic Church further obscures the possibility of assessment by citing Lumen Gentium statements that declare the bishops are, quote, the heralds of faith, authentic teachers of the apostolic faith, and, quote, endowed with the authority of Christ. It does not say they should be authentic teachers, etc. In this way, we are taught to assume that bishops share the same objectives as the church. These magisterial documents do not consider the very real possibility of a bad bishop or encourage Catholics to be discerning. Gregory the Great taught that Catholics should keep Hosea 5:1 in mind. Bad priests are a snare and ruin for my people. According to him, no one does more damage than an evil man with the title of holiness, which is why he advocated for arming the laity with the sword of discernment. Gregory warned the bishops to avoid the trap of seeing the power of their rank as personal power, and encouraged them to focus instead on the equality of their nature with those they serve. Applying institutional analysis to the visible and human side of the church suggests that we might want to use the model of the fragile state rather than the perfect society when considering the crisis. The first step in such a process is to recover the importance of the human, visible, and social elements of the church that are analogous to other human societies and organizations. This means we must admit that canon law, governance, and institutions can and do change, that can be flawed and outdated. We must formally recognize that priests and bishops do not necessarily share the goals and objectives of the church. Perhaps most importantly, we should revise statements in the Catechism that suggest otherwise. Doing so entails returning to an understanding of the church that distinguishes between person and office, office and organization and institutions. The next step would be to invite Catholics with expertise in economics and social sciences to uncover the institutions or rules, both formal and informal, perpetuating the problem. My research suggests that institutions or rules that presume the holiness of the clergy and the superiority of the clergy need to be reformed. Power differentials inhibit reporting, and presenting priests and bishops as the preachers of truth as ontologically superior and as having the authority of the apostles establishes insurmountable power differentials. Perhaps the clergy can recover a sense of the paradoxical relationship between humility and authority. The greater the humility in service, the greater is one's authority in the church. Institutions that protect the privacy and reputation of offenders need to be set aside. Many people who file complaints within ecclesial organizations never hear what actions are being taken. This creates a disincentive to report. And the traditional ecclesiology that interprets the threefold responsibility of bishops to teach, govern, and sanctify needs to be reformed if it's taken to mean that there can be no independent lay oversight in assessing how well bishops or religious superiors are handling the sexual abuse cases. For most of the Middle Ages, there were forms of lay oversight. For example, in 1064, Peter Damian wrote a letter urging Duchess Adelaide of Turin to reform her dioceses or the dioceses in her territory, and even to correct the bishops if necessary. If governance has changed, it can change again. In order to change existing institutions, the Catholic Church needs to establish a third-party accountability structure or structure with the power to audit everything and to publicize what's found. Finally, the various informal rules related to gift giving, patronage, and promotion should be brought into the light and reformed in a transparent and collaborative manner. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Colt. Great, we all back. So another striking paper, certainly a bold introduction, turning us or asking us to look not so much at the pastoral response on the church, but to look at it as a more organizational culture and how we contend with it that way. in its own way, it presents a series of challenges, and that tension between the organisation and the pastoral response. There's other tensions too in the papers we've had, those between the history of the abuse and the immediacy of the pastoral response. So there's a series of tensions there, and I'm not sure how many people we've got in this Zoom meeting, but we don't have any immediate questions in the question and answer box. So I just wondered in the first instance whether any of the speakers had any questions to the other speakers. Otherwise, I will launch in.
Well, perhaps a practical question from my side. I would say abuse is a very sensitive thing, definitely. And abuse has to be told from two perspectives. We have the perspective of the victim, and we have the perspective of the one who commits the crime, so to speak. And I would say what Colt brought in is quite interesting. The role of the institution. Institution in form of the Catholic Church is hierarchy. And I would say one consequence from abuse is that this traditional concept of hierarchy has to be questioned. This is what I would say. This is not, let's say, up to date anymore. And this has consequences for the function, the role of canon law. This has consequences for the training of future priests. And this has consequences for how do we train future priests on the topic sexuality. Yeah. But I find Colt's statement quite interesting. Institution hierarchy, this is a key.
Mm. One of the challenges is, I mean, two things. Firstly, I'm very much reminded of the Australian experience of contending with the indigenous people of Australia and the way that the government felt called to apologise, etc. One of the things that's come out of that very clearly was that an apology is not always an apology. Sometimes we give apologies for matters of expediency, not least for the sake of the institution. And for that, and if you're talking about change, you really do need an empathetic understanding and relationship as a sort of condition of change. One of the things that strikes me in the English context is because in some instances, but not exclusively, we're dealing with historic cases, although the issues are still very much alive, we have priests removed from parishes where there are no survivor voices, because those survivors may have been from a totally different time period, a different geography, etc. So you have sort of parishes seeking this sort of reform and trying to respond, but because of the historical nature, they lack that sort of empathetic relationship with the survivors. So, I mean, it's a very striking point Colt makes, but I would never want that to underplay, I don't think, the importance of that sort of that pastoral outreach. Now, there's a lot of good points Colt made. I think the task is a little more complicated. We hear a lot about reforming structures, and we hear, for example, in the seminaries, yes, we try to teach more human formation. We try to have the priests out in the community a little bit more. But there's all sorts of different cultural inflections underneath that. Just anecdotally, and I don't know if this is the same for American seminaries, do the seminarians wash up after their meal? These are tiny little sort of cultural practices in a way, but if you're trying to teach a group of people servant leadership, and you're not even instantiating them in a system where they're doing those basics, as the old saying about bishops goes, a bishop never goes hungry. These are very sort of, you know, these are the practical things around sharing and food that sort of instill. So again, I'm still, the question of institutional and organizational changes, I mean, you're not going to change a prison. Prisons have to be hierarchical in a way. I mean, this was one of the things that comes out of it in the Feltman's work. Sorry, Lisa, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, could I jump on that? So I teach at a school of theology and ministry, and so we are actually involved. We are formators for men who are studying for the diaconate and men in the pre-theologate. About 95% of my students are men. And this conversation, like what you're pointing to right here about the necessity of human formation, of course, we have these 4 dimensions or pillars of formation that are constantly being discussed, is really a very serious concern for us. And my experience interacting with other seminary faculty is that there's a very deep sense right now that we have to become much more serious in our approach to human formation of men that are going to be serving the church in ministry. There hasn't been, and this is where I'm a little bit challenged by your presentation, Colt, because I feel part of the problem is we've become too institutional and too bureaucratic. I mean, these guys go through these evaluation meetings, which are supposed to be very formal, almost scholarly academic meetings where we assess them according to different metrics. But it's been pointed out lately that any guy who's a good operator, like anybody who can jump through the hoops of an academic system can jump through the hoops of a seminary. And what we're not looking at are their basic human capacities, so exactly what you were saying, Dr. Pound, like, so discussions are shifting to things like, does this guy even reply? Does he reply to your emails? How does he interact with you? What do we want to have more contact with these men. A lot of seminaries are moving to a model where formators live with the seminarians, because you're not going to see a lot of the problems outside of daily life. I mean, it's like a family, right? You need to be with that person, and you need to start asking questions that arise from that. So I guess that would be one problem. And I guess I want to kind of throw this out to both of you gentlemen. And I have to say, both of your talks just completely went right straight into my heart. I mean, I think what you're pointing out, both of you, is so serious, grave, and it has to be taken very seriously. So I don't mean to undermine it in any way, but when we're talking about the history of the church, so my background, one piece of my background is in the history of the saints. So I spent 8 years as a researcher on the lives of the saints. And it seems to me that when we talk about, for instance, penance, when we talk about penance, we talk about sin, and that's all we're talking about. Nobody is doing penance. I'm sorry. Like, if you look at the history of the church, I mean, when Thomas Becket was killed, King Henry, he did penance. Read up on that. He had to build a whole monastery in penance. I mean, he had to lay it out. Nobody is doing real penance. And I feel that like that hasn't even been tried yet. Okay, that would be one thing. And the second piece I would say is, when we're talking about lay oversight, just be careful what we ask for, because lay oversight is Catherine of Siena. Lay oversight is Hildegard von Bingen. I mean, this is what when God wants, I mean, Catherine of Siena was literally a lay woman. She's a third order Dominican. This is what God will call forth, is strong, I think, prophetic voices in this moment. I hope he does. I love the theme of this conference, paradox, because I think it provokes the need for, or it provokes our attention in the direction of these voices that can start to disrupt things. So, but I do think that when you're talking about that, I mean, Catherine of Siena had both a very passionate critique of the Pope, and at the same time, a deep love for him. She would address him as her father, as her daddy. So both of those things were present in this saintly woman figure. So I think that that's, I mean, I'm not seeing that these days either. And so I'd love to see that, to shake up the hierarchy. But anyway, that's what I wanted to throw those things out there.
Sure. I'd like to respond briefly. That's okay.
Absolutely.
As a seminary professor for 9 years in a pontifical institute, Mundelein Seminary in Illinois. Beautiful. And I was also an advisor to Cardinal George. I was an apostolic visitor and was sent to investigate seminaries back when that happened, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. So I'm all in favor of formation, and I'm all in favor of pastoral care. I'm just saying that is the way everything is being framed. And I don't think that the primary problem lies there. I mean, that's a problem, how well we're doing formation. But I think the primary problem really has to do with the fact that there's that isomorphic mimicry thing that I talked about. So when I was sent to investigate seminaries, we have this document called the Program for Priestly Formation in the United States. And I found all these problems, and I would go to the bishop who was the chair of our team, and I would say, well, this student, this candidate is suffering from some sort of psychiatric problem, probably schizophrenia, according to the records that I was looking at. And the PPF says that someone with a serious mental illness should not be admitted into the seminary. And the bishop would say, well, it says should not. It doesn't say must not. And if it says should not, I can dispense with that. So we have this program for priestly formation that looks pretty set, pretty strong. But when you start digging into it, you realize that bishops can dispense with many, many, many elements of it. And then the other formators at the seminary would not hear that. And I found that in my investigation too. So I don't want to sound like I'm opposed to pastoral care or reform or, the pastoral side of it's super important. But you have to have a system that actually does what it says it does and doesn't play games. Like the students should know how to work in English, for example, if they're in an English speaking seminary. Should isn't must. So I found one case where there was a Vietnamese candidate who spoke no English, who failed every course, and who sat in that seminary for 4 years as prescribed, that does say must, and was ordained. Okay, so that's an institutional problem. Right? That's not just the problem of a few people not doing what they ought to do. There's a whole system of rules and stuff that you have to follow. And the more you learn about these rules, the more you begin to see that a lot of what you think is solid is not. And I think that that's a real problem. And then someone like Catherine of Siena, who I wrote about in my book, which I'll promote now, The Great Catholic Reformers. That book came out, I think, in 2007. And I took a total pastoral care reform approach. It's all about exhorting and admonishing, converting people, getting them to follow the rules. And I stood in that way, and then I saw that really things weren't getting that much better. And as a historian, I study, in particular, High Middle Ages, and I studied the failures from the First Lateran in 1121, 23, I don't remember right now, all the way up to the Fifth Lateran, 1512. Again and again and again, they passed laws. And again, the things didn't get better. They get better a little bit here, they get a little worse somewhere else, and then the problems would reemerge. And I think we're in a similar pattern now, where things are getting better if a local bishop pays attention or a local superior is conscientious, gets better. But then that person dies or moves on, somebody else comes in, and if they're not paying attention, the progress is lost. And I think that's kind of where we are. A lot of places are getting better because we have a lot of people who do care and who are paying attention. But there are other places where it's not happening. And we need to get out of this system, because every time a new scandal hits, at least in the US, we lose more people. We need to get ahead of it, I think, and have our own internal systems. I don't know exactly what they should be like, because I'm not a political scientist, or I'm not the kind of person, I'm not a canon lawyer. But I think that's what we have to consider.
Can I just quickly respond to this? I think this is a great comment that you just made, and I'm actually totally grateful for it, because you're really bringing your own experience forward here, which is profound, really. I mean, I guess the final question I would have to you is, does that, what you're proposing, mean that we have to completely radically change ecclesiology, or whether the sources for what you're proposing, which I think are really all good proposals, are already there in the ecclesiology? They're just not really being brought forward. That would be my question.
I think it's part of the tradition. I think that, up until the late 11th century, there was a more collaborative model of reform. So you did have a kind of built-in third-party accountability. Now it was corrupt in a lot of ways. And so I understand why the 11th and 12th century theologians wanted to separate themselves from the political powers of the day, because, of the context of the world at that time. But times have changed. And, we used to have a more collaborative model. We could again. I don't think we should change the ecclesiology. I just think that governance, how we understand governance, has shifted over time, and that using a resource mont approach, we can recover earlier models. Exactly which is the right model, frankly, I don't have the expertise to suggest that. And that's why I'm trying to invite people who have expertise, lived Catholicism, right? Catholics who understand political science and economics and international development and reform of institutions. I'd like to find a way to invite them into the conversation to help us as a group think our way forward.
Thanks. I wonder if we could also other voices in from the conference as well. We've got a couple of questions here. We've got one from Anne-Marie Riordan, I think. Does the Catholic Church fully understand the outworkings and dynamics of clericalism? And this points to, I think it was you, Colt, you mentioned that, yes, we need to hear from the survivors and we need to hear from the sort of the hierarchy of the institution. We also need to hear from the bystanders. And this question, how do we become aware of and not promote clerical mindsets within ourselves? And are the seminaries fully committed to dismantling clericalism in their formation programs? So I'll just repeat that. Does the Catholic Church fully understand the outworkings and dynamics of clericalism? How do we become aware of and not promote that mindset within ourselves?
I would say that we don't fully understand the dynamics of clericalism, or I would say the starting point. If the starting point is clericalism is sin, then the answer to that is conversion and grace. And I'm not denying that clericalism can be understood as a sin. Okay, because it clearly could be. Pride is actually what usually people point to when they talk about clericalism as a sin. But I think it's different. It's cultural, it's embedded. So the clericalism is the idealization, and the idealization influences us all, not just the priests and not just the victims, but all of us. And so that's the reason why if a priest denies something, for example, the rule is you believe them. The rule is that Father is holy and you should accept what Father says, unless, of course, it's so egregious that, you can't sort of square it. So I think that, we have an understanding of clericalism, but I think it's the focus on the sin aspect of it is important, but not enough. It's not sufficient. And what I'm saying is we need to think about the church as just a concrete organization a bit, because we are that. We're the body of Christ. That's really important, people of God. But we're also an organization that has embedded rules, institutions, organizations, and structures. And most of the work that I see among my fellow theologians isn't paying attention to that. It's not seen as theological. And I think it's something that Massimo brought up on, yesterday when he talked about Kamanchek and the importance of recovering social sciences and studying that human visible dimension of the church. I think it needs to be done in tandem with the theology. Anyway, I'll stop there and let some of the other panelists respond.
Yes, Matthias, Lisa, did you want to respond to that question about clericalism, how we contend with it in ourselves?
Well, having a look at the Polish or the German situation, I would say we have a problem within the church, and we have a complicated and multifaceted system. And this is what Colt actually brings in. We have this holiness and we have this sin aspect. And I would say in the long run, and the pandemic is one development. In the long run, the church will definitely lose another big group. In the 19th century, we lost the working class. Then we lost the women, and perhaps we lose the women and the children. And people leave the church. You can, of course, say leaving is also a chance to renew. But I would say the structure as such, this is a problem of the church. The church at the moment in Germany has a lot of problems. It's considered to be outdated, too much hierarchy. And of course, Colt, what you said is in seminaries in Europe, and again in Germany, in Poland, we take everybody. And this cannot be the case. These people who want to become priests, they have an extreme responsibility in the 21st century, and they have to be prepared for this. And we have lots of problem cases leaving seminaries because the bishop need these priests. This is actually what Carl said. And then these priests do mistakes. They are sinners as you and we, everybody is. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing too, these priests that shouldn't, these guys that are in the seminaries who shouldn't be there, you know, as a seminary professor, we had two seminarians who had apparently brought a prostitute into the rectory when they were on their pastoral year, and it was reported. And they asked us whether we, you know, there's a vote whether we find this person worthy to move forward. And all of us, all of the faculty voted no. Since then, the Vatican has taken away lay people's right to vote. Okay, but anyway, we all voted no. And then when ordination day comes, there they are, and they're ordained. You know, it says, well, after consulting people, we found these men worthy. And so then I found out, well, what it really means is the rector found them worthy. And the rector has to be obedient to the bishop. And so the whole notion that the seminary faculty is, as a group, judging who is worthy and ought to move forward is a fiction. And these fictions not only hurt lay people and the church in general, but they are crushing the good men who go into seminaries and go into priesthood, because then they have to carry all the dead weight and they have to fix all the problems of the men who never, ever should have been allowed through in the first place. And so I speak out of a love for the church. I've devoted my entire life and career to trying to help the church become better. And I worked out of these pastoral care categories. You know, that's why I wrote about Catherine of Siena, for example, because she's this powerful model of a layperson. But she didn't actually have oversight. She just had like a presence and a rhetoric and an ability to, like, you know, affect conditions. But what I'm saying is we need some people to know that, in fact, that, you know, if a man is like schizophrenic and showing all of these problems in the seminary, that somebody is actually going to stop that person from moving forward to ordination, which what I've seen in the US as both a seminary professor, I was the dean of Washington Theological Union, so training Carmelites and Franciscans and others. So I know the internal aspects of that pretty well. That's something that has to be fixed. And, you know, St. Peter Damian, because I'm a medievalist, said it's better to have no priest than a bad priest. But, you know, when I went to investigate the seminary with this bishop, who I can't say who he was, but he's like very prominent among the conservative Catholic bishops in this country. You know, I said, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this with this guy who doesn't know anything? He's failed all his classes. Why is he still in the seminary? And the answer was, I need men.
Yeah. This is a general danger. Lisa, did you want to? There is a question here in the box for you as well, Lisa.
Oh, okay.
This is from Elizabeth Ridley, and it's asking, has there been much work done on the spirituality of the survivor? So you might, whether you want to respond to.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just say briefly about that the woman that I cited, Carrie Bucalo, that's kind of her work. She really is a person who has thrown herself into this idea of the spirituality of the survivor. So I would recommend her website as like a starting point for that. It's healedbytruth.com. That's her website. But I wanted to kind of respond to the question about clericalism in ourselves, because I think that's, you know, I don't know the context for people that are coming to the conference, but I think, you know, like the everyday, you know, lay Catholic, it's like, okay, like I don't like clericalism, but what is it and how do I avoid it? And I really do want to speak to this because I think it actually points to the problem. I mean, we can't, if you're going to baptize somebody, you need water. You can't baptize with Kool-Aid, right? And if we're going to ordain a man, if we're going to marry a couple, what needs to be present is a significant human being. Like we do need human formation. And that's where I really applaud what's going on here at this conference, because I completely agree that we need to draw on everything that's out there now for the formation of these men, you know, sociology, psychology, the whole gamut, but also just fundamental human formation in the family, formation in human interactions, vulnerability, capacity for relationship, capacity to be responsible, to, you know, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. I mean, there's so many basic human factors that are necessary. And I would just say that that's really how we, you know, you combat clericalism is in yourself, is to live humanity and to seek it in others. And to me, it's a big red flag when you meet a priest who is clearly not able to function on a human level. I mean, that's really, and you know, everything from can't interact with women to, you know, taking a prostitute into his room and the whole gamut, right? I mean, this is the thing. So I would just say, in terms of everyday, you know, avoidance of clericalism, it's about getting to the bottom of our humanity, living that all the way out there, which we don't typically do in the West because we tend to suppress ourselves all the time. And that's really the starting point, both for forming priests, but also just forming good people, good married people as well.
Lisa, one of the things I've noticed, certainly in the UK, is that Catholics are less likely to call the priest father, more likely just to call them by their name, which is a very subtle little thing. But again, it's a way of, I think, just sort of gaining some sense of, I think it's one of those ways in which the English sort of over here, we've sort of attempted to confront that implicit sort of clericalism within ourselves. There's another little, you're the star of the show, because there's another little question for you here, Lisa. It says, and it's an important one, I don't want to take away from Colt's important point about the need for institutional reform. It's how can we find mechanisms in our scholarship to foreground the lived experience of survivors? This is from Alana Harris. Without cognizance of the ethical challenges, without re-traumatizing, and importantly, without instrumentalizing their experience. This is the laity's current sensus fidelium, the wounds that Lisa refers to. Seeing the wounds, touching and living with, and accompanying the pain.
Well, the first thing is always friendship. You know, there's actually Carrie, who I quote from, actually, I met her, we became friends, and over the course of a couple years, we've corresponded. And one of the things that I've realized is that, you know, it's very hard at first, if you are not an abuse survivor yourself, to listen to their stories and to be present to the actual, you know, there's almost a gut response if it couldn't have been really that bad. You know, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say one wants to defend the church, you know, and defend the people involved. And I think the most basic thing is friendship and companionship for these people. And I think that's precisely what they're lacking is, and I, you know, I've seen this over and over again in our parish. We had actually a parish priest that abused a lot of women in the parish I was part of for many years. And these women tend to be marginalized because people don't know how to talk to them. I think that, and a lot of them are still there in the pews. In fact, they're often the women that are even at daily mass because they are seeking healing, they're seeking sustenance. So I would just say the first thing is to be super patient. I mean, I think this, you know, this ties in with what we were discussing in the panel that I chaired yesterday. I mean, you know, time is mercy, right? We have to give all these things time. And we tend to think because we're Westerners and if you're an American, you're all into efficiency, right? You want to just have things sewn up very quickly. And all of these things take years to be dealt with. And so there has to be, you know, you have to become, like Wendell Berry would say, a sticker. You know, you got to stay in one place with a person and be willing to be present to them.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, we are about end of time now. I'm reminded of in the Middle Ages, of course, penance, as opposed to the Eucharist, was much more the place of women, as I think you said, Lisa. Most of the old sort of, you know, the sermons sort of that they collected in late medieval periods were owned by women, and that sense of penance for women was a strong aspect. I wonder, one of the problems we have in England, I think, is we don't really know what penance looks like. We're not even sure what it looks like for the church to be a penitent church. And that's an interesting question. But listen, the next session is going to be at 2:50, it says here, Living Catholicisms, and that's going to be with Professor Valentina Napolitana. It's been a huge privilege and really exciting to have all three of you here, Matthias, Colt and Lisa, and the dynamics I thought between the institutional issues and the need for the empathetic listening and walking with survivors, really fascinating, super stuff. And I would hope that going forward, maintaining that very tension is part of lived Catholicism in a way. It's certainly part of the bridges that we're trying to build between merely the popular study of what goes on the ground as opposed to the institution. And I expect real healing has to begin, because after all, it's not like the survivors want very much. Apology, recognition, etc., etc. So thank you for your contributions, and thank you especially, Lisa, for your sharing with us, because I do think these are important moments. So we'll hopefully look forward to seeing you in the next sessions, and thank you for your questions, which I didn't manage to get through all of them. I apologise especially to Francis Stewart, who provided a nice little sort of commentary on some of the aspects in the chat function. So I'll look forward to seeing you all later.
Thank you.
That's it. Big round of applause for our speakers. Hooray. And off we go. Bye now.